Chapter 691, Meeting Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios. There's no need for you to tell me. I've more or less confirmed it moments ago. Upon hearing Anderson Hood, Klein wore a calm expression as he mumbled inwardly. Back when he encountered Rionette Tynker in the spirit world where he saw her massive true form and Gothic-styled castle, Klein already believed that she wasn't someone to be messed with. And with Miss Messenger almost killing the strongest hunter with such ease, it made him believe without a doubt that she was a demigod, a sequence 4 at the very least. A demigod is willing to help me deliver letters for a gold coin per trip? It's obvious that things aren't that simple. Miss Messenger must have her motives. Of course, I can't disregard how I'm always encountering all sorts of strange matters. It might have piqued her interest, and she doesn't mind being a messenger since she happens to be free. Similar situations include Erodza's fawning and Snake of Mercury Will Oseptin's friendliness. Regardless, I should be wary and not fully trust her. Before having a chance to discuss similar matters, I shouldn't consider blowing the harmonica whenever I encounter danger. Who knows if Miss Messenger will just directly rip me to shreds. Klein instantly had many thoughts go through his mind while he continued wearing a stoic expression. Faced with the alarmed Anderson, all he did was slightly nod his head. It's none of your business. This guy is really mysterious. A spirit world creature at the demigod level is his messenger. Besides, he casually knows a demigod that's good at improving a person's luck. It's no wonder he's so calm and composed after offending the King of Immortality. It's no wonder the King of Immortality didn't dare to seek revenge or even appear. Anderson suddenly came to a realization as he couldn't help but carefully size up Gehrman Sparrow. Oh. Klein emotionlessly swept his gaze at the strongest hunter. Anderson hurriedly retracted his gaze as he chuckled dryly. I realize that you're very suitable to being the main lead of a figure painting, the kind that has a dark, gloomy background. This really accentuates your bearing. How about it? Do you want to consider it? I can help you draw a portrait. Believe me, I'm a master at this. Klein couldn't be bothered to listen to his nonsense. He lifted his golden pocket watch and opened it. Return to your room. I'll come for you in 5 minutes. All right, Anderson replied with a beaming smile. After the strongest hunter left, Klein took out Azek's copper whistle and Will Oseptin's paper crane before entering the bathroom where he set up a ritual. After placing Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina's pearl earring above the gray fog, Klein sat at the end of the long bronze table. There, he conjured a pen and paper and wrote a simple divination statement, Edwina Edwards's location. Holding the paper and earring, Klein leaned back into the chair and recited the divination statement as he entered a dream with cogitation. First, a gray world occupied his vision. Following that, plains blanketed in ice and snow were reflected in his eyes. The howling snowstorm enveloped everything as the area was covered with thick fog. It didn't appear like a real frontier. Klein quickly saw Edwina's figure. Her long brown was tied up simply at the back as the rest of it fluttered wildly in the snowstorm. Dressed in dark-colored trousers and a white waist-fitting shirt with complicated flowery patterns along the collar and sleeves, she gave off the feeling as though she was frail in such an environment. Edwina's feet, which were clad in leather boots, kept moving across the snow, leaving behind a series of clear footprints, but they were quickly wiped away by the violent snowstorm. The screen shattered in turn as Klein opened his eyes. He realized that he couldn't interpret Vice Admiral Iceberg's actual location from his divination's revelation. The poles? Faceax plains of Evernight? There's no way to confirm. Apart from the snowstorm, there aren't any features. Klein sat up and put down the pearl earring and the paper with the divination statement. After contemplating for a few seconds, he confirmed another matter, Edwina Edwards had really vanished. She wasn't in a golden dream, but it could also eliminate the possibility that it was a trap. Klein cautiously performed some divination on this matter and received the result that there weren't any traps on the golden dream. After some thought, he left the mysterious space above the gray fog and, via a series of procedures, brought the pearl earring back to the real world. Recalling the map of the waters around Oravi Island and the present location of the Golden Dream, Klein selected an uninhabited island that fishermen used to seek shelter from storms. In the letter, he got Danitz and company to steer their ship to somewhere not too far from there. After folding the letter, he blew his harmonica and once again saw Miss Messenger holding up the 4 heads. While handing over the reply letter, Klein coughed slightly and said, "Can you confirm Danitz's location?" One of the heads in Rionette Tinker's hand nodded before the rest spoke. "Yes. As long as he's not beyond range." Seeing that Miss Messenger remained floating there without any signs of leaving, he said with his eyes looking to the side, "The gold coin will be paid by Danitz." "All right." Rionette Tinker's figure quickly phased away. "Phew." Klein exhaled. After some precise preparations and dealing with the scene, he carried his suitcase which he had finished packing and walked out of the room. He then knocked on Anderson Hood's door. "We'll go somewhere else first before heading to Byam," he calmly told the strongest hunter of his decision. "You can choose to wait for me in Byam, or follow me." Anderson gave a cheeky smile and said, "I can feel my adventurer's blood burning in me. I'm very curious as to what matter that messenger has brought. I thought I had no means of knowing better, but to my surprise, you actually invited me." "I didn't. I'm only giving you 2 choices." Klein coldly turned around and walked to the staircase. Anderson hurriedly carried his newly bought suitcase and followed behind. Out of the hotel, Klein took a carriage to leave the port city. Then, he walked to the periphery of an uninhabited cliff on Mount St. Draco. Looking at the waves crashing into the cliff below, Anderson looked around in surprise. "This is our destination." Klein ignored his question. He took out a charm made of tin and softly chanted the incantation, "Storm." He infused his spirituality and split the charm into 2, half of it for himself, while the other half was used to augment Anderson. The remaining one was thrown down the cliff. Underwater breathing, deep sea membrane. Anderson identified the additional supernatural effects applied to him in surprise. At that moment, there was a loud splash beneath the cliff. A massive creature that resembled a whale surfaced from the sea. It was entirely dark blue in color. Its mouth was open, revealing its white teeth and blood-colored interior. Klein walked to the edge of the cliff and jumped straight down. With the charm's powers, he gently landed in the undersea behemoth's mouth. Anderson watched blankly before he jumped down in excitement, landing beside Klein. The massive undersea creature closed its mouth, turning the interior pitch black. Then, it submerged itself and began swimming for its designated destination. Inside its mouth, Klein's eyes produced a flash of lightning as he saw through the darkness. He found a tooth to lean against as he casually sat down. Due to the protection from deep-sea membrane, he wasn't afraid that his clothes would be dirted. "Man, this is quite fascinating." Anderson surveyed the area and asked curiously, "How did you come up with this? How are you doing this?" "Of course it's by praying to myself, then using the sea god scepter to pull a suitable undersea creature from nearby." Klein didn't reply Anderson's question. He half closed his eyes as though he was resting. "It's just a little stuffy." Anderson took out a cigar case and matchstick from his pocket. "Can I smoke in here?" "Ask it." Klein didn't open his eyes. Anderson chuckled dryly before putting away the cigar and matchstick. "I don't think it will like the smell of tobacco." In the dark sea, this massive creature swam quickly, efficiently drawing out the oxygen in the water via the use of its special organs from time to time. After an unknown period of time, it surfaced in front of an uninhabited island. After using the charm's power to go ashore, Klein took off his hat and bowed at the undersea creature. "You're very polite," Anderson said in amusement when he saw this scene. "I've always been very polite, even if I'm facing prey." Klein shot a glance at him as though he was including him. Anderson chuckled dryly as he pointed to the other side of the island. There's a ship there. Oh, it's the Golden Dream. At that moment in time, Klein had also seen the sailboat that had been scrubbed clean. On the ship spanning dozens of meters, a lustrous main cannon that didn't belong there was swirling with stacked cymbals. He immediately went over with his suitcase, and before long, he arrived where the Golden Dream was anchored. Then, he saw Danitz jump down from the deck as he ran across the water. Just as Danitz arrived before Gehrman Sparrow, deliberating on what to say, he suddenly saw a familiar figure. Anderson Hood, he pointed at the strongest hunter as he yelled. Anderson immediately roared with laughter. You didn't expect me, right? Although he didn't know why he would encounter the Golden Dream, this didn't stop him from having the idea of occupying the ship by force. You know each other? Klein indifferently swept his gaze towards Danitz. Danitz instinctively shuddered as he forced a smile. This guy isn't a good egg. In the Fog Sea, he's often pursued by a bunch of pirates, but in the end, all of those pirates would end up as bounty rewards. You might not be aware, but he started off in the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. Later, he was banished after failing his exams repeatedly. I heard all of this from Captain. They were former classmates. He gave Anderson a look of contempt, mocking his low intelligence. As for Flowery Bow-Tie Jodson and company on the ship, all of them showed similar expressions. Anderson's gaze slowly swept across their faces before tsking. That's not the main point. The main point is that I once pulled at your captain's hair. The scene instantly turned extremely silent as Danitz couldn't stop his expression from twisting. Chapter 692, Suspect Translator, Atlas Studios Editor. Atlas Studios. Seeing everyone on the Golden Dream aim their sights at Anderson, Klein took a step forward and said to Danitz, his side facing him, bring me to the captain's cabin. All right. All right. Danitz retracted his angry glare aimed at Anderson Hood. Prioritize Captain's rescue. Prioritize Captain's rescue, he kept repeating to himself. The Golden Dream first released a dinghy before lowering a gangway, allowing Klein to easily step onto the deck without using a charm. Anderson followed by his side, completely ignoring the glares of the Golden Dream's crew. With a smile, he strolled forward as he looked around, treating it as his own home. His mental fortitude is truly beyond remarkable. Yes, even after offending a demigod where he was forced to apologize in public and accept a mission, he was able to laugh at himself and enjoy a meal. Klein sighed inwardly as he walked towards third mate Jodson and company. Hello, Mr. Sparrow. I'm this ship's first mate, Brew Walls. A 1.8-meter tall man with a monocle politely bowed. The pirate, Gourmet, who's worth 6,200 pounds. The bounties on Vice Admiral Iceberg's pirate crew are clearly lower than Admiral of Stars. They live up to being treasure hunters who happen to be part-time pirates. Klein greeted him using Gehrman Sparrow's style of politeness, hello. I've heard about you. Huh, it's my honor. I'm only a treasure hunter who dreams to be an artisan, but I ended up having to be a gourmet, Brew Wall said in a self-deprecating manner. He pointed to the man beside him and said, our second mate, Singer Orpheus. Bounty of 5,500 pounds. The Beyonders on the Golden Dream all have very odd nicknames. I didn't know that they were the subordinates of a pirate admiral. I would have definitely believed them to be a traveling crew who sing and enjoy good food while holding bonfires as they seek out legendary treasure. It's truly a beautiful life. Klein cast his gaze at Orpheus and nodded. The singer had deep sculpted outlines and a head of resplendent blonde hair. He said with a sad smile, actually, I'm only praising the sun, but now, my son has disappeared. Klein nearly felt goosebumps all over him. Tisk, as expected of someone from Intis. He speaks like he's singing. What a pity, I grew up in Seeger, in Lemberg, and didn't pick up this ability, Anderson said with a chuckle. It wasn't clear if he was praising or degrading Orpheus. After all, half the blood flowing in his veins was Intis blood. Born in Senor and later studied in Lemberg. Yes, it was likely a church school. He's classmates with Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina. Mr. Orpheus is definitely from the Sun pathway, but he's unlikely to be from the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sunday. From his bounty, he's likely a Sequence 6 notary. I almost forgot to inform little son that I have his formula. I wonder what he will use in exchange this time. Klein turned towards Flowery Bow-Tie Jodson and Bucket Daniels before Gourmet Brew Walls introduced. We've met. Let's not waste any time. All right. Brew Walls heaved a sigh of relief, stroked his short beard and led the way into the cabin. If it wasn't for how famous Gehrman Sparrow was on the ship, he wouldn't have been that polite. At that moment, Anderson deliberately stayed behind, walking alongside Danitz, Orpheus, and company. He looked to his left and right, unfazed by how the surrounding pirates looked like they wanted to rip him apart. He laughed with a TSK. The one you should be wary of isn't me. Yes, we aren't wary of you. We only want to stuff you in. See that? Into that cannon. Danitz wasn't afraid that Anderson was the strongest hunter. After all, they were on the Golden Dream. There were plenty of pirates, and many of them were Sequence 6 or 7 Beyonders. Anderson curled his lips. I'm actually not a threat. Think about it, your captain definitely hates and detests me. She wouldn't even want to speak to me. Isn't that ideal? Danitz turned agape, but he didn't say a thing. He suddenly felt that what the pile of dogsh *T said made sense. The looks in the eyes of Orpheus, Jodson, and company also subconsciously turned gentle. Anderson chuckled as he looked at them. He said in a rather ethereal tone, the person you should be wary about is Gehrman Sparrow. Why? Danitz blurted out. Although he's a madman that warrants the need to be wary of him, he's not an enemy at the moment. Danitz silently added. Anderson laughed. I'm assuming. Assuming that Gehrman successfully finds your captain and rescues her, will your captain have fond feelings for him as a result? Besides, he looks pretty good. He has that cold and aloof aesthetic and is strong. He's at the level of a pirate admiral, and his background is especially mysterious. He's completely compatible. How is it possible? Danitz wished to retort, but he was momentarily at a loss for words. He felt increasingly more convinced that things weren't right. Orpheus and company had their expressions collapse bit by bit. They looked at Gehrman Sparrow's back with a newfound sense of wariness. Resolved. The provocation problem from before has been resolved. With a smile, Anderson walked into the cabin. When he arrived inside the captain's cabin, Klein first circled the room, which was nearly filled with bookshelves. On it were all kinds of books. The average captain's cabin is filled with racks of alcohol, he silently mumbled before walking straight to the desk by the window. According to Danitz's description, Edwina had vanished during her research. Therefore, finding traces of her research was Klein's goal. After he gathered enough information, he would head above the gray fog to divine the matter. At that moment, the desk was a mess with many things placed on it. There was white paper, a fountain pen, an ink bottle, a bronze dagger, and untidily stacked books. In the middle of the desk was a book made of goatskin. Its dark brown cover had the words, Grozel's Travels, written in ancient Fasak. Isn't this one of Vice Admiral Iceberg's collections? It has a mysterious origin and is suspected to be related to the Dragons and City of Miracles, Liveseed. Edwina was studying this before she disappeared. Klein looked at the book and instinctively made a guess. Seeing Gehrman Sparrow study the ancient book, Danitz forced a smile and said, "There's nothing wrong with it. We have already inspected it." "Is that so?" "I seriously doubt your meticulousness." Since someone had flipped it and there weren't any obvious abnormalities with it, together with the fact that Klein determined that Danitz was saying the truth with his spiritual intuition, Klein reached out for it and asked, "Have you read Grozel's Travels?" Danitz shook his head. Brew Walls, Orpheus, Jodson, and company shook their heads as well. Their expression seemed to say that their daily studies were tiring enough. They didn't wish to read any other books during their breaks. Swiping his fingertip across the yellowish-brown goatskin, Klein carefully and seriously read each page. Soon, he arrived at the spot where the pages were stuck together. From the corner of his eye, he saw what was written in it. That's not right. His gaze focused as he hurriedly flipped 2 pages back. He clearly remembered that his previous read stopped at Giant Grosel and his team preparing to challenge the Frost Dragon, the King of the North, in a head-on clash. There was nothing after that, but now, there were 2 more pages. It also meant that the stuck pages had thinned, and the book had 2 more pages. The chapters came to a halt for 1,000 years before it was continued. These are the fruits of Vice Admiral Iceberg's research. This also led to her disappearance. As Klein lampooned, he frowned as he read the additional content. The 2 pages described a lost female pirate. She encountered the King of the North in a blizzard, and she was nearly killed. Only by using all her strength was she successful in escaping before meeting the main lead's team who were here to challenge the Frost Dragon. There's the addition of a female pirate. Female pirate. Klein ruminated over this description as an idea suddenly came to him. Could she be Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina? She entered the book and became a character in the story. With this idea in mind, Klein quickly realized certain problems. Rhodes mentioned before that the past owners of Grosel's Travels vanished. Grosel's Travels has a giant from the Dark Epoch which is also the Second Epoch, an elf, an ascetic from the Third or Fourth Epoch, a Solomon Empire noble, and a Fifth Epoch lone soldier. The times are extremely chaotic. If they were all the past owners of Grosel's Travels who disappeared, that will solve the problem. They do not belong to the same period, and they were swallowed by the book, becoming a character in the story. Klein found his theory ridiculous as he thought about it, but it was highly likely. In the world of mysticism, this isn't impossible. I have to confirm it. Besides, what did Edwina and the past owners do to be swallowed by the book? And what should I do to release them? Klein retracted his gaze and thought deeply in silence. Soon, he looked up at Danitz and company. Prepare items like candles. I will be praying for an answer from a secret existence. And that secret existence is myself. Klein added inwardly in jest. He really is professional and crazy. Gourmet Brew Walls and company didn't dare to speak further. They hurriedly provided the materials before leaving the captain's cabin. They didn't dare to watch such dangerous rituals unless Gehrman Sparrow requested them to do so. Inside the captain's cabin, Klein locked the door, closed the windows, and quickly set up the ritual. Then, he brought Grosel's Travels above the gray fog. After placing the ancient book at the end of the long bronze table, he sat down and conjured a pen and paper. He then scribbled a divination statement. Edwina is in the story of this book. Chapter 693, Attempt Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios. After putting down the fountain pen in his hand, Klein removed the spirit pendulum from his left wrist, holding it in one hand and letting it hang down over the paper in close proximity. Edwina is in the story of this book. Klein closed his eyes and silently repeated the divination statement. After he recited the statement, he opened his eyes and saw the topaz pendant spinning clockwise. This meant that Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina was inside Grosel's Travels. It really is a world inside a book. Furthermore, the situation inside is very special. Without new characters, the story isn't able to continue. Klein indiscernibly nodded. Wounding the silver chain and the topaz pendant around his wrist again, he picked up a dark red fountain pen and wrote a new divination statement, the method to entering Grosel's Travels. This time, he used dream divination. In the gray, hazy world, he saw indistinct figures. The figures were of varying sizes, some huge, others slender. The thing all of them had in common was that they held a book with pages of yellowish-brown goatskin. The following developments branched off into two scenarios. A number of them vanished silently with Groselle's travels on them. The others would accidentally or deliberately drip their blood on the cover while carrying Groselle's travels with them before suddenly vanishing. The scene shattered and Klein opened his eyes to see the model table in front of him. He frowned as he made an interpretation. To enter or activate Groselle's travels, it either needs prolonged contact with it to a certain extent, or you would need to drip one's blood onto the cover. Isn't that too simple? Perhaps, it's really that simple. In the story, the lone soldier's first appearance was as an ordinary person who didn't know mysticism. With the help of his companions, he slowly became a disciplinary paladin. Therefore, the activation method isn't too complicated. An ordinary person is able to accomplish it. A small number of researchers before this, including Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina, were beyonders with sufficient amounts of mysticism knowledge. They knew not to rashly drip their blood, otherwise, death might occur without them even knowing it. This is akin to ordinary people using the correct form of magic mirror divination. It's very easy to provoke a powerful existence or secret existence. It's why no problems happen to them. Furthermore, Edwina keeps Groselle's travels in the collector's room most of the time and only interacts with it occasionally. As such, it was only when she recently had a new research concept that she had prolonged contact with it, completing the condition required to activate the book. Yes, even Rhodes only knew that there's something strange with the book. Many of the past owners had vanished, and it's suspected to have something to do with the Dragons and City of Miracles, Liveseed. This means that Groselle's travels will interfere with its surroundings when being activated, therefore, most of the collectors in the past do not know of its problem and had no thoughts of studying it. The owners who disappeared likely aren't limited to the ones in the story. The others might have died for all kinds of reasons, failing to leave their names in the book. Klein focused again and made another divination, hoping to obtain the method to leave Groselle's travels. This time, he saw a more tempestuous blizzard in the gray, hazy dreamscape. He saw a gigantic figure at the top of an ice peak. It was a translucent dragon who remained nearly 5 meters tall while standing on all fours. It resembled a lizard's cousin and had an ugly face with eerie blue eyes. It had a thick, powerful tail and a pair of gigantic wings covered in a skin membrane on its back. It seemed to blot out the sky simply by spreading its wings. Its scales resembled ice crystals as they swirled with a crystalline glow. It was the most beautiful and dreamy part of its entire body. Suddenly, the dragon, which resembled an ice sculpture, raised its neck and body, and it let out a terrifying roar that penetrated through the blizzard. At that moment, it reached 10 meters tall by standing up on its hind legs. King of the North. That frost dragon. Klein left the dream and tapped the armrest of the high-back chair. His interpretation of the divination revelation was that the key to leaving Groselle's travels lay with the King of the North. Klein's initial guess was that only by helping the main lead, Groselle, accomplish his goal, slaying the frost dragon, would the story come to a complete end, opening a passageway to exit the book. However, I can also attempt to see if I can forcibly break open the barrier between the world in the book and the real world. Klein relied on his rich experience to quickly come up with an attempt. He first picked up the Black Emperor card, which was facing down, and he infused it into his spirit body. Suddenly, Klein's body was covered in black full-body armor. On his head was a heavy crown as his aura became majestic and dignified. It exuded an awe-inspiring vibe. Following that, he stirred the powers of the mysterious space above the gray fog to the limit, making them surge over like a tidal wave. Upon seeing this scene, Klein didn't hesitate to summon the Sea God Scepter from the junk pile before he infused his spirituality within. The blue gems on the end of the bone scepter lit up one after another, emitting a blinding luster. Countless silver bolts of lightning surfaced as they zapped about the grand palace as though they were forming a sea of lightning. Finally, Klein used the suppressive power and balance from the Black Emperor's loftiness to infuse the stirred powers into the lightning storm. Rumble. Thunder resonated above the grey fog and into the distance as thick bolts of lightning smote down, striking Grozel's travels. Blinding light enveloped the entire palace for a full 20 seconds. After everything was over, Klein looked at the target again and discovered the model table was in shambles. As for the dark brown leather book, it was completely unharmed. Only its ends curled up a little. It's far more impressive than I imagined. That's right, how can an item which can create a whole new book world be simple? Heh, I wouldn't have made a loss buying it for £8,000 back then. It can be used as a shield. It can definitely defend against attacks from saints. The only problem is its tiny size. It won't be able to shield much. Klein's thoughts raced as the bronze table was quickly restored to normal. Since there was no way to forcibly tear open the barrier between the world inside the book and the real world, he could only consider how to enter it according to the normal procedures. Get some blood, bring it up here and smear it across the cover, and then enter as a spirit body with the Blood Emperor card and see God's scepter. This way, I don't have to worry about encountering King of the Five Seas, Nast, as there's no way he can sense it. He won't be able to enter the world inside the book either. But the problem lies in the fact that rescuing Vice Admiral Iceberg this way will allow her to determine that Gehrman Sparrow is Hero Bandit Black Emperor. Yes, there's a more important problem. Entering with a spirit body means that the body is still in the outside world, the captain's cabin of the Golden Dream. I have no idea how time flows in the world inside the book. It might easily be a few days. That way, my body might meet with an accident since it lacks protection. I'm in unfamiliar territory as well. When the time comes, I might rescue Edwina, but I would find myself gone. That would be fun. Klein quickly rejected the idea of entering as a spirit body. He didn't trust most of the people on the Golden Dream, and he also felt wary of the strongest hunter, Anderson. His attempt to divine if it was dangerous to enter the book to rescue Edwina was met with failure. Klein thought deeply for a moment before returning to the real world. Then, he unhurriedly brought back Grozel's travels and removed the traces of the ritual. Looking out the window at the impending dusk, he walked to the captain's cabin's door, unlocked the door, and opened it. Gourmet Brew Walls, singer Orpheus, and company were all outside. None of them had left. There were even sailors who peeked their heads out from the staircase. Any clues? Brew Walls blurted out his question, but he didn't hear his voice because everyone at the door was asking the same question. Klein swept his gaze and nodded. Instantly, he heard sighs of relief, then he saw all kinds of happy and excited expressions. If I were to vanish one day, who would act like that? Klein focused his thoughts and said to Danitz, I need an assistant. With that said, he turned to walk to the desk. All right. Danitz hurriedly followed and familiarly locked the door. Is there anything you need of me? He hurriedly asked. He looked as though he could already see his captain being rescued through his hard work. Klein stood by the desk and solemnly said, What happens next will be very dangerous. Very dangerous? Danitz instinctively gritted his teeth. You might vanish or even die immediately. Klein told him the worst possible outcome. Seeing how serious the madman, Gehrman Sparrow, was, Danitz instantly understood the gravity of the situation. His heart sank as he subconsciously became frantic. What does this have to do with rescuing Captain? It's directly related, Klein answered succinctly. Danitz's expression twisted as he fell silent for 2 seconds. What will happen if nothing is done? Your captain might be left there forever, or she might die in the next second, Klein said truthfully. Danitz turned agape as he closed his mouth in silence. His eyes turned adrift for a few seconds before they focused back on Gehrman Sparrow's face. Gritting his teeth, he said, Let's begin. T, he softly cursed himself. Klein picked up the pen and paper on the table, scribbled a note, and folded it into a square before handing it to Danitz. Put it into your pocket. Read it after you enter. Enter. Danitz asked, puzzled and clueless. As he spoke, he automatically took the paper slip and stuffed it into his trouser pocket. Klein didn't reply as he pointed at Grosel's travels. Smear some of your blood on the book's cover. This. As Danitz made a vague guess, he picked up the bronze dagger beside him and nodded heavily. All right. Chapter 694, Burn Upon Chanting Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios. Danitz held the bronze dagger and sliced across the back of his left palm, but his hesitation prevented him from using much strength. He looked up and forced a smile. Although I've been injured many times, pain still leaves me afraid. Get to the point, Klein replied coldly. Danitz gave a hollow laugh. I'm just a little scared of pain. Just as he said that, he exerted strength with his right hand, slicing open a wound on the back of his hand with the bronze knife. The words he had said was apparently to divert his attention so that he could reconcile with the idea of pain. Blood quickly seeped out as Danitz immediately put down the dagger. He dabbed some blood on his right finger and smeared it across the dark brown cover of Grosel's travels. After finishing that, he held his breath, waiting for a change. Suddenly, he saw a snowflake the size of a goose feather. Strong winds howled by his ears, and immediately, a biting chill wildly drilled into his body. Although Danitz was mentally prepared, he was still alarmed. He instinctively looked around to confirm where he was. He realized that at some point in time he had left the captain's cabin of the Golden Dream. He found himself in a land of frost wrecked by a blizzard. Due to the extreme environment, he couldn't see into the distance at all. He couldn't even tell if he was on a mountain or on a flat plain. I've really entered a strange world. Captain is here too. Danitz held up his hand to block his face, afraid that the snow would get into his eyes. He calmed himself down and recalled Gehrman Sparrow's instructions. From his pocket, he hurriedly took out a piece of paper that had been folded into a square, and he carefully unfolded it. While doing this, he was especially afraid of any accidents that could lead to the paper tearing or being blown away. That would make him lose all hope, but thankfully, none of that happened. He saw the contents written by Gehrman Sparrow. Recite the following honorific name in Hermes, but preferably in ancient Hermes, the fool that doesn't belong to this era. The mysterious ruler above the gray fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck. Burn this upon chanting. This is a secret existence at the level of a deity. Due to Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina's strict education, Danitz wasn't illiterate when it came to mysticism. He even had quite a good foundation. Looking at the piece of paper in his hand, he subconsciously drew a gasp, sucking in the cold wind and ice-cold snowflakes that left a biting cold. He immediately coughed as his expression turned twisted. He was now able to confirm one of his past theories. Gehrman Sparrow really did belong to a powerful and very secretive organization. And the organization consecrates an existence known as the Fool, a godlike existence. Indeed, such a powerful and crazy fellow can't appear out of nowhere. They don't just sprout out of the ground. Danitz tugged at his collar and tightened his clothes. Looking at the piece of paper fluttering in the wind, he wore a clear look of hesitation. He knew very well how dangerous it was to recite the name of an unknown secret existence whose intentions were unknown. It could lead to an outcome more terrifying than death. Captain is also trapped here. Furthermore, there's no way of leaving. Danitz clasped his hands and placed them before his mouth. He suddenly threw out his hands and used ancient Hermes to recite the fool's honorific name. On the Golden Dream, in the captain's cabin. With his own eyes, Klein witnessed Danitz turn illusory without any reason before disappearing. There was no longer any question about how entry into Grosel's travels could be achieved. After patiently waiting for a moment, he heard a series of illusory pleas, and it clearly came from a man. Phew, from the looks of it, Grosel's travels is unable to block out the gray fog. The world inside the book is still connected to that mysterious space. This way, even if I were to enter, I wouldn't be entirely cornered or lack any trump cards. Klein didn't hide his sigh of relief. To confirm it, he took 4 steps counterclockwise while chanting the incantation. After arriving above the grey fog, he saw the brilliance representing Danitz rippling outwards beside the fool's high-back chair. The body and soul enter together. The world inside the book is very stable. There's no way to shatter it just by pulling the spirit body. Indeed, if it's possible, the divination from before would have received the corresponding revelation. Using the sea god scepter is too dangerous. Bestowing Danitz directly will only speed up his death. Klein half closed his eyes as he emanated his spirituality. After taking everything in for a moment, he arrived at many conclusions. He didn't delay and returned to the real world immediately. Holding the bronze dagger, he wiped away Danitz's blood on it with a piece of paper. After folding a piece of paper and putting it into his pocket, he began to consider his next move. From the looks of it, smearing blood allows direct entry. This way, I don't have to worry about my body suffering any accidents. Furthermore, I can very quickly resolve the problem. But similarly, I can't be careless. I have to be careful of any other dangers. If there's anyone on this ship that might be problematic, they might be able to sneak into the captain's cabin after I enter Grozel's travels, sacrifice this book to the true creator, primordial demoness, or hidden sage. I'll be in trouble then. I'll definitely suffer something worse than death. The Golden Dream sailors mostly seem to be infatuated with Vice Admiral Iceberg. The fact that Anderson's superficial provocation was effective enough proves this. Therefore, telling them that this involves Vice Admiral Iceberg's life and getting them to watch each other so that no one enters, that will put me at ease. The problem lies with Anderson. He's the strongest hunter. He's stronger than any of the Beyonders on board this ship. Furthermore, he's good at ambushes and infiltration. There's a small possibility that he can avoid the monitoring of others and secretly sneak into the captain's cabin. His background is still too dubious, and I have no way to really trust him. I have to think of a way to get him to enter Grozel's travels with me. Amidst his thoughts, Klein flipped through the ancient book covered in yellowish-brown goatskin. He discovered that there wasn't any new content, and the story lacked traces of Danitz's existence. This is to say that one needs to successfully survive and meet up with the lead's team before they will be considered a true part of the story. That will make more pages appear. Klein made a preliminary guess as he walked to the door again and opened it. Did it succeed? Flowery Bow-Tie Jodson and Company asked. Klein shook his head and said calmly, next up will be a long ritual. No one is to enter and disrupt it, otherwise, it will lead to Edwina Edwards's disappearance forever or even her death. After informing them of the main point, he looked around and directly said, I suspect that one of you here might have problems. Everyone is to watch each other. Gourmet Brew Walls instinctively wanted to retort out of habit when he suddenly saw the captain's cabin was empty. Danitz, who had just entered, was gone. Recalling the captain's disappearance, and confirming that Gehrman Sparrow was about to attempt to save her after finding the cause of the problem, he nodded and said, I'll be in charge of this matter. And they will also monitor me. Klein didn't harp on the topic. He then turned to look at Anderson Hood, who was leaning against a wall. Come in. Anderson curled the right side of his mouth as he'd sked. People not in the know might think I'm your subordinate. Your attitude is basically a role model for provokers. Despite his grumbling, he straightened his back and opened his stride before entering the captain's cabin. After closing the door and locking it, Klein turned to face Anderson. Are you interested in participating in a rare adventure? You might be able to fulfill the achievement of hunting a dragon. According to his observations over the past few days, he believed that Anderson Hood was a curious and adventurous hunter. He enjoyed learning about new things and experiencing novel forms of excitement. Anderson stared at Gehrman Sparrow's face and sized him up seriously before smiling. I'm not interested. He firmly shook his head. Following that, he chuckled before Klein spoke again. I smell danger. A highly conceited, crazy, and powerful adventurer is actually inviting me to adventure together. What does this imply? It means that it's extremely troublesome and dangerous. I thought you would be interested. This is different from how you usually act. You really can rein yourself in and let go of yourself. I'll try another threat. If it doesn't work, I'll throw this fellow on a deserted island and let the Golden Dream sail off. We'll pick him up later. As a hunter, survival on a deserted island shouldn't be difficult for him. Klein quickly made up his mind as his gaze immediately turned cold. He looked at Anderson and said, I will not permit having latent risks around myself. Anderson was stunned for a second before he quickly smiled. It was just a joke. I'm very interested in the title of Dragon Hunter. You changed your mind way too quickly. If you had insisted a little longer, you could have enjoyed the feeling of being abandoned. Klein nodded, walked back to the desk, and said to Anderson Hood who had followed behind him, smear your blood on this book's cover. There's no need for too much. Smear it. Anderson scrutinized Grozel's travels out of curiosity before surveying the area. Edwina's disappearance is related to it. Same for that failure of a hunter's disappearance. Ah, right. Blazing Danitz. I nearly forgot his name. Thankfully, his bounty is a bit higher than before. The corner of Klein's mouth twitched as he replied frankly, that's right. Interesting. Anderson glanced at the desk, picked up the bronze dagger, and indifferently sliced open a bleeding gash in his hand. Right on the heels of that, he carefully put down the dagger and smeared the blood on the dark brown cover of Grozel's travels. After a few seconds of observation, just as Anderson was about to pick up the bronze dagger and wipe off the remnant blood on it, his vision was suddenly blanketed by a blizzard. Seeing Anderson disappear just like Danitz, Klein picked up another piece of paper and wiped away the blood on the dagger before folding it and putting it into his pocket. He wasn't sure if the trio would appear at the same location after entering the world inside the book. Therefore, he made preparations by having materials needed for dowsing rod seeking. After doing all of this, Klein held that dagger and streaked it across the back of his hand. His facial muscles twitched as he looked diagonally downwards. Only after a few seconds did he exert strength. His body shook slightly as his head turned to the side. The corners of his mouth couldn't help but open. When the blood flowed out, Klein, who was still holding the dagger, grabbed his cane and quickly smeared the red liquid over the ancient book's cover. After a short delay, Klein found himself amidst a white land of snow. Chapter 695, Stark Contrast Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios gales with icy fragments and goose-feather-sized snowflakes blasted at Klein's face repeatedly. As he surveyed his surroundings, he couldn't help but tense up. He bent over slightly as he trembled. How cold! He nearly cursed out as he confirmed that he was in a land of ice and snow which had extremely low visibility. He originally imagined that the moist coldness of Backlund's winter was terrifying, but he now knew that absolute low temperatures and strong winds that were as sharp as blades were a deadly combination. Even though he had worn an additional sweater ahead of time, and his coat was thick and long, he still couldn't withstand the chill. He didn't wear sun brooch because the heat generated was psychological. It could be used to resist the influence of the intense chill for a short period of time, preventing his body from turning numb. But faced with an everlasting icy environment, it was equivalent to suicide. Heat at the psychological level made one's pores open up as though one was in summer. It would peel off the final layer of defense against low temperatures, and it would even proactively welcome it. Therefore, Klein threw the mystical item above the gray fog. He planned on using it only on certain special occasions. He couldn't afford to delay while in such harsh environments. After a preliminary observation of his surroundings, he immediately burned the blood on the bronze dagger and stuffed it into his pocket. Following that, Klein took out the adventurer's harmonica and blew into it. Amidst the howling winds, he failed to discover the appearance of Miss Messenger, Tinker Rionette, through the spirit vision he activated. Indeed, this place isn't connected to the spirit world. Or it should be said that this place has a unique spirit world for itself. From the looks of it, praying to see God would be useless. Only charms that point to the mysterious space above the grey fog would tear through the barrier. Here comes the problem. As a believer of the God of knowledge and wisdom, Edwina knows the true God's honorific name. Why didn't she seek his help? Or did she try to no avail? Yes. Not every deity will personally reply to their believers. Many a time, they seem to provide feedback based on certain laws. You probably can't find a second, secret existence, like me who takes on jobs like myself. Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh and made a preliminary judgment. He then put away his harmonica, took out the paper slip with Danet's blood, and he wrapped it at the end of his cane. Danet's location. Klein softly said as he began using dowsing rod seeking. Then, according to the outcome, he traversed across the thick snow, and he quickly tore through the frosty winds under the gloomy sky. From time to time, he would carry out a divination and adjust his bearings. After all, Danetz wouldn't wait in his original spot, as he would end up as an ice sculpture by doing so. About 10 minutes later, Klein discovered a scarlet flame. Phew! He exhaled before taking a few steps forward to identify his target. It was indeed Danetz. This famous pirate wore rather thin clothes. He wrapped his arms around himself as he walked forward with a lost expression. However, he didn't seem to be that cold. This was because scarlet fire ravens were circling around him. They were boiling the snow and blocking out the winds, bringing about a spring-like warmth. In such times, Klein especially admired a pyromaniac. Although a magician had the same ability to summon flames, it was an offensive ability that couldn't be maintained. It could only be used for a split moment. To rely on it to warm himself, he needed to constantly cast it, tiring himself out quickly. As for flame controlling, it depended on existing flames or ignitable materials. Both of them were extremely lacking in this world of ice. As he saw the fire ravens soaring into the air, Klein sped up his pace and approached. Danetz jumped in fright when he sensed someone approaching. When he saw who the newcomer was, he immediately heaved a sigh of relief. Then, with an odd expression, he forced a smile. There's no stars to be seen here. Getting lost is inevitable. Klein ignored what he said as he directly asked, have you burned it? I did. Danetz hurriedly nodded, his entire being effusing with indescribable fear. Klein observed Danetz for a few seconds and, after confirming that he wasn't lying, produced the polite smile of Gehrman Sparrow. Remember. Chanting his honorific name makes you his believer. Danetz's expression twisted as he forced a smile which looked worse than crying. I don't want to change my faith. I have no intention of believing in an unknown existence of dubious origins. He inwardly roared crazily but didn't say a word. He suspected that any retort he makes would lead to him being buried in the snow by the madman. Klein wore a smile that had hints of madness. He added with a calm tone, remember, keep it a secret. Once divulged, you and your captain will both die. What has this got to do with Captain? Danetz blurted out. Klein maintained his previous expression as he smiled at Danetz. Guess. Danetz gaped his mouth. With the reason known, all he could do was give a hollow chuckle. Do I look like someone who can't keep secrets? Klein nodded. As he took out the paper slip with Anderson's blood, he chuckled and said to Danetz, believe in him. Serve him. Perhaps one day, you will become a blessed like me. When the time comes, your name will spread across the 5 seas. You will be in no way inferior to a pirate admiral. As he spoke, he planned on adding a gesture as the fool's believer, but sadly, he realized that he didn't have such a gesture. All he could do was console himself. A secret organization needs to be secret. Doing all these kinds of superficial actions is meaningless. Mr. Hanged Man was right. No way inferior to a pirate admiral. Danet's eyes suddenly lit up. Since I've already chanted the honorific name of this secret existence, there's really no way to avoid it from a mysticism point of view. I might as well take this opportunity. He instantly had many thoughts, having even named his future child. If it wasn't for Gehrman Sparrow's persona, I would have directly said that you would have the reputation and strength that matches Vice Admiral Iceberg when the time comes. Of course, whether she likes you will be a whole other matter. According to my observations, you stand little chance. The partner Edwina wishes to have is someone who can study and improve alongside her, someone who can discuss all kinds of knowledge. Klein mumbled as he used dowsing rod seeking again. Anderson Hood's location. He came in too. Danitz was first taken aback before he asked in surprise. Klein finished chanting the statement, released his cane, and determined the direction in which it fell. He then nodded and said, I'm worried if he stays outside. So you're also wary of Anderson Hood? Danitz couldn't hide his smile as he echoed, that's right. He's the kind of person who smiles on the surface but will stab you in the back once you turn around. His reputation in the Fog Sea is terrible. There are no pirates that like him. He even deliberately tried to sully you, making us be wary of you, to view you with animosity. If pirates were to like him, it would only mean that his title as strongest hunter isn't substantial. I heard Anderson's provocations. Klein didn't reply. He picked up his cane and proceeded through the blizzard. Danitz followed closely behind, using fire ravens to scatter the snow and block out the cold, so that they too didn't need to freeze. Not bad. Quite sensible. At that moment, Klein once again experienced the benefits of having a servant, to have someone hold an umbrella during a rainy day, and someone to provide warmth in a blizzard. In the white vastness, the two appeared like black dots, trudging through the snow. They proceeded forward for nearly 20 minutes before arriving at the location where the dowsing pointed to. He isn't here. Danitz surveyed the area and failed to find any traces of Anderson Hood. He didn't have any doubts about Gehrman Sparrow's dowsing rod seeking, because he was the last person to be found with it. Klein frowned as he activated his spirit vision and enhanced his spiritual perception. Suddenly, he sensed something. He prodded forward with his cane, causing the snow in front of him to collapse. The collapse revealed a cave. Inside it were dark rocks that were reflecting the light from a fire. Klein crouched down. In his vision, he discovered that the cave extended into a narrow passage. And at the end of the passage was a bunch of glowing red rocks. Strange underground plants were slowly burning as Anderson Hood sat beside it. He was leisurely roasting an animal that resembled a rabbit. The fragrance of the fats and the warmth it brought were emanating out, drilling into Klein's and Danitz's noses. You guys are finally here. Want to give it a try? There's actually a strange rabbit around here that can live in such ice and snow. Anderson bent down, looking towards the entrance as though he was greeting companions on a camping trip with him. Although he didn't say anything provocative, I really wished to beat him up. Klein entered the cave with a stoic expression. He came close to the fire and experienced the long-awaited bliss. Danitz followed in tow. He looked at the fire which was roasting a rabbit and then at the fire ravens beside him before silently dispelling them. How did you find this cave? Danitz asked in disgruntlement, unwilling to admit his inferiority, but his body betrayed him by leaning closer to the fire. Anderson turned the rabbit which was impaled with his pitch-black sword, and he shot Danitz a glance. First lesson of being a hunter. Observe your surroundings. Be familiar with your surroundings. Make use of your surroundings. Danitz's expression immediately froze. Anderson looked at Gehrman Sparrow and chuckled. It's a cave I blasted open. How is it? It's not bad, right? I controlled my strength perfectly. As he spoke, he took a whiff of the air and said, how fragrant. The roasting seems to be done. Do you want to give it a try? Although I didn't bring any spices, there's rock salt here. It will just be a little astringent. Are you sure you can eat this? If it's a beyonder creature, you might lose control with just one bite, Danitz said with a tsk. Anderson glanced at him. Second lesson of being a hunter. Distinguish what can and cannot be eaten in the wilderness. He carefully reached out his hand, pulled off a leg, and stuffed it into his mouth as he ate it with relish. Klein was just about to say something when he suddenly felt a wanton aura approach from afar. The suppressive feeling that came from a high-leveled creature appeared extremely real. It made Danitz tremble uncontrollably. The aura swept across them without noticing the strangeness of the cave beneath it. It then quickly departed. King of the North. The title flashed across Klein's mind. Chapter 696, Giant Guardian Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios. As the tyrannical aura flew past, high in the sky, Anderson's chewing came to a sudden halt. It was only when the entity was a distance away did he swallow the remaining rabbit meat. He looked up at Gehrman Sparrow. That was the dragon you were talking about? Klein nodded slightly, confirming Anderson's guess. The corners of Anderson's mouth slowly curled up, revealing an expression as though he was at a loss on whether to laugh or cry. I thought you were talking about a mature or adolescent dragon. The one that just flew past. I probably won't be able to become a dragon hunter. Dragon feces perhaps. The tyrannical feeling that the King of the North exudes is indeed a little terrifying. Compared to the pieced-together monster which made hair grow without restraint on the future, it's a lot stronger. Perhaps, it's a sequence 4, at the level of a demigod. Klein calmly made a judgment without revealing any hints of panic or horror. He clearly remembered that Grozel's travels had clearly indicated that the female pirate had managed to succeed in escaping from the King of the North's attack before meeting up with the team led by the main lead, Grozel. And Edwina Edwards clearly wasn't a demigod. She was a sequence 5 of the reader pathway. Furthermore, as she was suddenly swallowed by the book, certain mystical items and sealed artifacts that she didn't permanently keep on her person were left in the captain's cabin. The tools she had that were useful to her were probably limited to 1 or 2. Under such a situation, she was able to defend against the King of the North and survive. Having just advanced, and having adjusted his inventory, Klein believed that it wouldn't faze him too much. Furthermore, he was still connected to the gray fog. He could use the sea god scepter to produce a response. This was also why Klein dared to enter directly after confirming that Danitz was in an ordinary state during his prayer. Yes, the King of the North doesn't seem like a demigod from a normal pathway. According to Vice Admiral Iceberg, it's a rampager who gathers frost-related beyonder characteristics, and it can match a demigod in certain domains but would have flaws in other aspects. Edwina, Anderson, and me, along with the beyonders of the main lead's team, we wouldn't be helpless. If all else fails, I can still use the sea god scepter. I don't believe that this book can defend against items above the gray fog. If it could, it would have shown it long ago. Standing beside the fire, Klein looked down at Anderson and grinned. Are you afraid? Anderson was taken aback as he immediately beamed. Not at all. You seem to be very confident. After saying that, he looked at Danitz, who was still trembling and trying hard to compose himself, before Tsking. Do you know what's the most important thing for a man? Danitz had just taken a deep breath. He was stunned by what he heard as he held his right index finger and middle finger together, pointing to his crotch with uncertainty. Anderson blinked before he roared with laughter. B****, you really are a crude pirate. I wanted to say something, but... I can't remember it. Oh right, I wanted to say courage. Courage is the most important thing for a man. Look at you. The dragon hasn't even attacked, and you're almost hugging your head and begging for mercy. Danitz's face instantly flushed red as he glared at Anderson. You weren't acting like this back at Toscarter. Klein couldn't help but lampoon. Danitz was just about to make it clear that he was only influenced by the high-level creature when he suddenly recalled what was just said. His expression was immediately restored to normal as he casually replied, "I can't compare with dragon feces at all." Anderson's smile froze as he coughed lightly. As though nothing had happened, he yanked off a rabbit's leg and handed it over to Gehrman Sparrow. "Want a bite?" Klein remained silent for a few seconds before he slowly shook his head. "This is a strange world. Before confirming that there aren't any problems, it's best not to eat anything here. Perhaps it might be a piece of rabbit meat that will make you stay here forever." Anderson moved the roasted rabbit's leg to his nose before slowly putting it down. Following that, his face collapsed. "Why didn't you say so earlier?" Klein calmly replied, "I just thought of this problem." Anderson's expression turned twisted as he lowered his head. He quickly bit down on his roasted rabbit leg. "Aren't you afraid that something really bad will happen?" The strongest hunter's actions alarmed Danitz. Anderson laughed helplessly. "I've already eaten one earlier. I've already digested it by now. Since there's no way of turning back, I might as well focus on enjoying it." Klein and Danitz were momentarily at a loss for words. After Anderson finished gnawing on the rabbit's leg, he deliberated and asked, "Are you really not eating? We have no idea how much time we'll be spending here. If we really do starve, how are we supposed to fight the dragon?" Klein didn't reply. He took out his golden pocket watch and opened it. "It's 6:10 in the evening outside. We'll eat a little after 4 to 6 hours if nothing happens to you." Anderson turned agape, speechless. Klein ignored him and turned to say to Danitz, 15 minutes break. We'll search for your captain after that." As he said that, he had already taken out the pearl earring belonging to Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina Edwards. "All right." Danitz suddenly felt pumped with his blood boiling, completely forgetting the cold outside. But after about 8 seconds, he huddled close to the fire again. Around 7 in the evening in the outside world, Klein pressed down on his hat and held his cane. Together with Danitz and Anderson, he followed the revelation provided by his divination and found their way to a mountain. After circling the boulders which were encased in thick layers of ice, they saw a dark mountain cave. Standing by the entrance was a woman holding an ancient bow. The woman had a head of soft, lustrous black hair which she had simply tied into a pigtail. Her facial features were soft, making her look different from any national of the northern continent. She wore a brown ancient-styled hunter's coat and trousers. She acutely cast her gaze over. Upon seeing her slightly sharp ears, Klein immediately guessed her identity from matching her to the content in Grozel's travels. She was the female elf who got to know the giant, Grozel, at the very beginning. Her name was unknown. Compared to Earth, people from the northern continent look more Caucasian. But this elf has more of an oriental charm. Klein quickly concluded this particular trait. An elf. She's identical to the elves drawn in the ancient church drawings. Anderson suddenly became excited. I have to negotiate with her to get her to be my model so that I can draw a few portraits of her. By the side, Danitz scoffed. He mocked in a succinct manner, boorish. Clearly, he hadn't forgotten Anderson's previous mockery. Do you only know of that kind of drawing? Anderson shot a glance at him, sped up, and walked towards the female elf. Just as he approached, the female elf didn't hesitate to raise her bow. The arrow strung on it shimmered with silver lightning. Wait. Anderson immediately raised his hands. It's useless. The elves mostly belong to the storm pathway. They are prone to being irascible and rash. Klein secretly activated his spirit body threads, planning to achieve initial control over the elf in order to let her listen calmly. At this moment, Anderson saw a blur before seeing two thick, huge, muscular grayish-blue legs. Embedded in the snow was a huge, terrifying sword. Anderson was horrified to realize that his height only reached the leg's knees. He instinctively followed the sword and looked up, bit by bit. With his head almost completely facing upwards, he finally saw the giant who was nearly 4 meters tall. The giant's skin was grayish-blue. His abdomen and waist was covered in a thick furry beast hide, leaving him naked everywhere else. Even his legs lacked protection. He pounded on the sword which was wider than a human door, and using his trademark single vertical eye to look at Anderson, Klein, and Danitz, he asked with a booming voice, "Who are you? Why are you here in the Grosel camp?" Klein was just about to reply when a familiar figure suddenly walked out from the dark mountain cave. Danitz's eyes were instantly filled with ecstasy. Dressed in a complicated shirt and dark-colored trousers, Edwina swept her gaze across the trio. Her usually cold expression revealed a rather flabbergasted look, as though she hadn't expected to see Gehrman Sparrow and Anderson Hood here. She quickly composed herself and looked up at the giant. "Grosel, they are my companions." Grosel widened his huge mouth into a grin and asked in delight, "Are you also here to help deal with Ulyssin?" "Ulyssin?" Klein was momentarily left at a loss for an answer. At that moment, he saw Edwina, who was standing in the giant's shadow, give him a look. She wanted him to give an affirmative answer. "Ulyssin is the king of the north?" Klein replied in thought, "Yes." "Huh, then we are friends." Grosel looked down at the trio and laughed. As he spoke, Anderson silently retreated back to Gehrman Sparrow's side as he said under his breath, "This is the first time I'm meeting a living giant. There's no way of hitting his vital spots. He's just too tall. You can hit his legs." Klein lampooned and calmly replied, "A huge target makes it easy to strike them." "That's right." Anderson agreed. At that moment, Edwina walked over and introduced the three of them. "This is the leader of the camp, Giant Guardian Grosel. This is the elvish songster, Ciadas." "Elvish songster? Ocean songster?" Klein suddenly felt that there was hope for Mr. Hanged Man's potion formula. Edwina turned halfway around and said to Grosel and Ciadas, "They are my companions. The strongest adventurer, Gehrman Sparrow, treasure hunter, Anderson Hood, and renowned sailor, Danitz. I always thought Vice Admiral Iceberg was the serious type who never lied." "Renowned sailor. Ha, in a certain way, that's true." Klein took off his hat and gave a serious bow. Anderson followed suit in a rather casual and perfunctory manner. Reeling in his delight that his captain had introduced him as a companion instead of a subordinate, Danitz was slower than the others as he acted in a fluster. Grosel laughed. "Come on in. We will be fighting that evil dragon, Ulyssin, at any moment now. How warm and amiable. But be it the church's canon or the myths of the City of Silver, giants are extremely violent creatures who have a strong desire for destruction. Yes, anything is possible in a book. It all depends on whether the author can make everything flow nicely." Klein nodded slightly as he followed Grosel into the spacious cave. When Edwina saw this, she approached the trio without showing any signs of abnormal behavior. As though she was leading the way, she whispered, "The history they speak of is a little odd. Same for their language. Regardless of the language they speak, all of us can understand it." Chapter 697, Stories Progress Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios. Everyone can understand each other regardless of the language used. Klein skipped over Edwina's first sentence and focused his attention on the second sentence that didn't seem too problematic. Although this was the book world created by Grosel's travels, everything was possible, but there were certain details that still revealed problems. To Klein, he wasn't too caught up with how that they could understand each other, but the kind of method that resulted in the comprehension. This world incorporates something akin to the rule of language comprehension, or does it have a conscious residing high above everyone else, helping in the real-time translation work, just like what I do at the tarot gatherings? If it were the former, targets who don't understand Jotun will only hear an unfamiliar language, but they would understand the meaning. If it were the latter, it will be them hearing a language they're familiar with. As he knew many ancient and supernatural languages, Klein was unable to figure out the situation immediately. He slowed down his footsteps and walked alongside Danitz. He asked while suppressing his voice, "Can you tell what language Grosel was using when he was speaking?" Danitz was taken aback for a second. He recalled and said, "It's a language which sounds a little familiar yet unfamiliar, but I was able to understand everything." The supernatural languages he knew were ancient Hermes, followed by Elvish. He was only a beginner in Jotun. Yes, it's something like the rule of language comprehension. It's comprehension at the level of the mind. This means that the entire book world's fundamental rules can be different from the outside world. It's a setting that it comes with, but the changes don't seem capable of exceeding certain limits. This point remains suspect and requires verification. After all, I can't eliminate the existence of someone like the fool, someone who completely interprets the communication via the mind. Edwina is indeed sharp and good at observing. The problem she discovered leads straight to this book world's essence. Amidst his thoughts, Klein unhurriedly entered the huge, dark cave. As for the history described by the members of the main lead's team, he wasn't the least bit surprised. He even looked forward to hearing the details. Klein long knew that the various churches and the northern continent's countries had consciously attempted to destroy or conceal information, to hide the true history of the fourth epoch, third epoch, and even the second epoch. What people knew as common knowledge actually differed from the people who used to live in those eras. This was also one of the reasons why Klein took on the risk to enter the book world. Inside the spacious and windy cave, a bonfire scattered its light and heat on three humanoid figures. One of them was a middle-aged man in an extremely Spartan white robe. He had wrinkles but didn't appear old. He had his back to the fire as he faced the stone wall with his eyes closed, focused on his prayers. He had short brown hair, and his shoulders, arms, calves, and feet were exposed, revealing all kinds of old scars. Beside him was a lad using a stone for a pillow. He donned a black, heavy full-body armor. By his hand was an erected black sword that emitted a cold shimmering light. His facial features were rather deep, giving him clear lone traits. Sitting opposite the two was a man in his 30s who was dressed strangely. He gave people a sense of unease. He wore a sharp and hard black hat, and his coat's buttons were mismatched. It was messy and chaotic, highly asymmetric and unharmonious. In addition, the tips of his leather boots curled up high, making him look like a circus clown. This man had quite a handsome face. He had flaxen-colored hair, deep brown eyes, a high nose, and thin lips. Even though he sat there, he gave off an arrogant feeling. Edwina pointed at him and said, "Solomon Empire's Viscount Mobit Zoroast, a gentleman who can take away the ideals and dreams of others. You don't have to mince your words." "Hello there, I'm a Sequence 5 Dream Stealer of the Marauder Pathway," Mobit said with a chuckle. He acted nothing like the arrogance he seemed to exude. "A member of the Zoroast family. The angel parasitizing Leonard's body is from this family. Perhaps they know each other." "Heh, I now know the name of Sequence 4 and 5 of the Marauder Pathway, but I don't even know the corresponding Sequence 6 and 7. Many thoughts flashed through Klein's mind as he maintained his stoic look. At that moment, Anderson warmly greeted him with a smile and asked as though they were pals, "To be frank, this is the first time I'm hearing of Dream Stealer. I only know of Marauder and Swindler. There are two sequences in the middle I'm not aware of. Are the Beyonders of this pathway already so scarce? Doesn't Edwina know? Sequence 7 Cryptologist and Sequence 6 Fire Bandit. Let me do the introductions." Mobit warmly pointed to the praying man whose back was facing everyone. "The pious ascetic, Snowman. He believes in the Lord that created everything, the omnipotent and omniscient God. Don't mind him. He's completely sealed himself in his beliefs. But in combat, he's a very reliable companion. Snowman, you should say something at the very least." Mobit, who didn't receive a response, stroked his chin with a rueful smile. This is the treatment I often receive. You might find it hard to imagine that I was an arrogant, reserved, and refined nobleman. But time has changed everything. Heh heh, that happens when your companion is a giant who only knows how to chuckle foolishly and shout slogans. When he said this, Grozel, who was sitting on a rock, smiled in a simple and good-natured manner. He raised his hand to scratch the back of his head as his single vertical eye didn't show the ferocity and cruelness that giants were strongly rumored to have. Mobit shook his head and pointed at the ascetic, snowman. As for him, he might not speak a single word for years or even a decade. Ciadas is a very violent woman. As long as there are any emotional stirrings in her, she'll beat me up. Sigh, I'm as afraid of her now as I was infatuated over her back then. Therefore, I can only make conversation and speak to them, otherwise, I'll definitely go mad. Thankfully, Frunzier came later. He's quite the conversationalist. Hey, Frunzier, wake up. We have new companions. The sleeping black-armored knight slowly woke up as he looked at Klein and company. Suddenly, there was the sound of metal striking each other as he stood up. Staring at Klein, he said, Loanese. Yes, Klein nodded frankly. He discovered that this lone soldier who had gone missing for 165 years didn't look old. He had black hair and sharp, blue eyes. He made one submit to him unknowingly. Frunzier appeared adrift for a moment as he quickly composed himself. Do you know of Backlund's Edward family? Backlund has many Edwards, Klein replied simply. The Edward family that lives at 18, Delahire Street in Northwest Borough, Frunzier pressed anxiously. Klein shook his head. Northwest Borough no longer exists. Northwest Borough no longer exists. Frunzier repeated those words as his voice grew softer. He fell silent for a few seconds before exhaling. I've no idea how many years have passed outside, but it should have been quite a while. Edwina told me the actual year, but I don't remember the year I entered. I was sleeping most of the time, and time here seems to be frozen. Mobit Zorost chuckled upon hearing that. That's because you have bad luck. Back when we were passing through cities and villages, everything was perfect. He looked at Klein, Anderson, and Danitz. Back then, we lived in places with humans, with intelligent races. We got married again and again, seeing our wives turn old, grow weak, and die. Before a new member joins, we would forget our goals. We would lead ordinary but happy and relaxed lives for decades or centuries. The only con is that we aren't able to bear our own children. Later, Frunzier came. We entered this region blanketed by ice and snow. We hunted many monsters, but gradually, we began to fall into a slumber. We were seldom awake until we met Edwina. This means that time in the book world flows normally. The story's progress is maintained by a certain power that influences the main lead's party. Before new members join and before the book's pages flip, they'll stop and stay at a certain node, doing other things. This is similar to the intertranslation of languages at the mind level. Conversely, does this also mean that towns and villages in the book world also develop normally? Yes, I have to quickly find King of the North Ulyssan, otherwise, with the passage of time, we might also experience that influence and fall into a slumber or forget the main quest. We'll stay here for a long period of time until a new member is swallowed into the book and finds us. Klein fell silent for a few seconds. Just as he was about to say something, Edwina said, "There's no need to worry about that problem. We will soon encounter the King of the North." Why? Anderson and Mobit asked in unison. Edwina surveyed the area and said, "Before I entered, the stuck pages in the book only had a few more pages. And now, with you entering and finding the camp, there definitely can't be many pages left. The story is about to come to an end." Mobit nodded indiscernibly in agreement with Edwina's judgment. Anderson softly mumbled terms such as, stuck. Edwina then introduced Klein, Anderson, and Danitz as she made an example of herself and sat down beside the bonfire. Klein took off his hat and held it with his cane. He slowly sat down and looked at Mobit Zoroast, who was inclined to chat. "Have you heard of the Tudor Empire and the Trunsoist Empire?" He didn't beat around the bush and asked directly. That was Gehrman Sparrow's persona. "No." Mobit shook his head. "Edwina has already asked me. In my era, the Tudors and Trunsoists were just like my Zoroast family. We're aristocratic families of the Solomon Empire and were loyal subjects of the Black Emperor. So the Trunsoist and Tudor families were traitors of the Solomon Empire." Klein thought and said, "Apart from you, what other aristocratic families did the Solomon Empire have?" "Many." Mobit smiled as he looked at Frunzier. "Augustus, Abraham, Zeradal, etc. In my era, the Church of the Evernight Goddess's archenemies were the Church of the God of Combat and the Southern Continent's Aegir's family. The churches of the Lord of Storms, Eternal Blazing Sun, and the God of Knowledge and Wisdom were all at odds with each other, all of them hoping to gain the support of the Solomon Empire." He paused for 2 seconds as his expression gradually turned solemn. "Back then, deities walked the land, and not in the astral world." Chapter 698, 5th King of Angels Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios Deities walked the land, and not in the astral world. In the early 4th epoch, during the era of the Solomon Empire, there was no distinguishing between the worlds of myth and reality. Deities directly walked the land without the need for a descent. This is somewhat similar to the 2nd epoch as written in the City of Silver's books. The Giant King's court and other locations are separated by a door in the real world. They just needed to pass through it and return the same way. Mortals and deities mixed together in the chaos and darkness. Also, the astral world really does correspond to deities. After hearing Viscount Mobit Zoroast's description, Klein instantly began connecting the dots. He subconsciously swept a glance at Grosel, as this giant was very likely someone who had experienced the history of the 2nd epoch. Grosel picked up a cup larger than a wooden bucket and gulped down some melted snow as he laughed. "Mobit, what's there to be surprised about? Why are you so solemn?" "I've no idea why I became so solemn either." Bit by bit, Mobit Zoroast revealed a smile. It might be something very normal for us, but in their eyes, it's terrifying and unbelievable. I have to use a suitable expression to describe it in order to achieve a satisfactory result. Do you still remember Frunzier's expression when we told him those stories in the very beginning? He almost knelt down to seek forgiveness from the Lord of Storms. Klein, Danitz, and company were momentarily unsure of the expression of words they should use to respond. Anderson leaned over to Gehrman Sparrow and said with a suppressed voice, "I think he has the talent to be a provoker." He appeared to be suppressing his voice, but his words could be heard by everyone present. Mobit didn't mind as he chuckled before continuing, "I know that you aren't very convinced and find it unbelievable that deities walked the lands, just like Edwina's previous reactions. I can give you 2 examples. The Chasm of Storm on Pasu Island and the Tenebrous Heaven in the Amantha Mountain Range were the divine kingdoms of the Lord of Storms and Evernight. They were divine kingdoms located on land. They were divine kingdoms separated from the real world by a mere illusory door." Pasu Island? Isn't that where the holy altar of the Church of Storms is? The Amantha Mountain Range. Amantha means serenity in Hermes. This refers to a holy cathedral, the Cathedral of Serenity. When the deities no longer walked the land, their kingdoms became the headquarters of their respective churches. Klein instinctively believed that Mobit Zoroast wasn't lying as he used it to come to certain conclusions. Danitz was puzzled and horrified by what he heard. He subconsciously wanted to leave, but when he saw his captain listening attentively, Gehrman Sparrow who was in thought, and Anderson Hood who wore a look of interest on his face, he could only hold back his urge as he sought a better, more comfortable seating position. At that moment, the elvish songster Ciadas, who was in charge of the perimeter, walked in and said with contempt, "Do not mention that fake god. The authority of the storm only belongs to the king of us elves. Her voice was clear and beautiful, but her tone was filled with anger and irascibility. It felt as though she would raise her hands at any moment to shoot an arrow at Mobit Zoroast. "All right, I will use the words, fake god." Mobit raised his hand to adjust his sharp and hard black hat. Ciadas retracted her gaze. She then said to the former lone soldier, Frunzier Edward, who wasn't a staunch believer of the Lord of Storms, "It's your turn." Frunzier raised his head a little, his expression in a trance-like state. Apparently, he hadn't noticed the conversation and argument from before. He drew the iron-black sword beside him and walked towards the cave entrance. Klein observed for a moment and took the opportunity to speak to the elf, Ciadas. "Do you know of Queen of Calamity, Kohainam?" He wasn't actually sure if Kohainam was Elf King Saniathrim's subsidiary god, Queen of Calamity. His inquiry was for elvish songster Ciadas to give him the answer. Ciadas's gentle and exquisite face immediately produced a trance-like expression like Frunzier's. "I haven't heard her name in a long time. She is the queen of us elves." Mobit and Frunzier didn't even know of her existence. "Where did you encounter her, learn of her situation?" As she spoke, Ciadas's tone became urgent. At that moment, Danitz looked at Gehrman Sparrow in surprise, reflecting over the revelation that the madman was so knowledgeable. He was even able to share a common topic of interest with an elf from ancient times. "I never expected you to be a scholar." "I really couldn't tell." "Couldn't tell at all." Anderson sighed as he shook his head. Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina likewise cast her gaze at Klein. Her limpid blue eyes had a strong desire to learn from him. Klein answered frankly, "I've once entered a ruin belonging to Queen of Calamity Kohainam and obtained some items." "Ruin?" Ciadas ruminated over that word in a soft voice, her tone having seemingly lost something unimportant, but something that she couldn't bear to part with. From the situation inside, she might not be truly dead. After seeing Ciadas's eyes light up, Klein went straight to the point. "Do you have the Ocean Songster's potion formula? Can I use something to exchange for it?" He felt that being honest and direct with a Beyonder from the storm pathway was the best choice. Ciadas thought and said, "Use one of Her Majesty's items for the exchange. I only obtained a wine cup made of gold. It's already been crushed flat. Complicated patterns are engraved on it, with the elvish phrases Calamity and Kohainam." Klein didn't hide the truth. "I know about that cup. It was the cup Her Majesty loved the most," Ciadas said, unable to hide her excitement. "Deal. The cup is outside." Klein had no intention of heading above the grey fog in front of everyone. Ciadas nodded. "I understand. We will complete the transaction after we leave this book." Having said that, she pressed her palms together. "The storm will definitely belong to the elves." Before anyone spoke, she asked curiously, "What else did you discover there?" "Some murals depicting the elf king battling an ancient sun god." Klein shot a glance at the ascetic, snowman, who believed in the Lord that created everything, the omnipotent and omniscient God. With his back still facing the fire, the middle-aged man who was facing the stone wall finally opened his mouth. "No, he isn't the sun god. He is our Lord, the Father of all things, the great source of everything. He wasn't battling the elf king, but taking back the authority which belonged to him." Just as Snowman said that, Ciadas stood up and aimed her arrow at him. Suddenly, this elvish songster's plaited black hair flared up in violation of the laws of nature. The strands of hair were distinct and they were all swirling with silver lightning, emitting a strange deep blue luster. Just as Ciadas was about to release the arrow, a huge grayish-blue palm appeared before her, blocking the arrow tip, without any fear of being struck. It was the palm of the giant, Grozel. One of the traits of this race was its exaggerated limbs. They were so long that they appeared a little distorted. Therefore, simply by sitting there, he could stop Ciadas by extending his arm. "All right, snowman, cut it out. As you know, Ciadas is an elf who likes to put actions before words, Grozel said to the ascetic before turning his head to the elvish songster. Ciadas, we are companions who can leave our backs to each other. We have experienced plenty of dangers together. You can retort Snowman and even beat him up, but do not attempt to harm him. As expected of the lead of the book. He's filled with positivity. But what's the difference in beating him and harming him? Klein couldn't help but mumble. Ciadas grunted and sat back down, turning the mood heavy and silent with a level of awkwardness. Giant Grozel used his single vertical eye to survey the area before chuckling. Then, I'll talk about my past. Before entering this book, I lived in the Giant King's court. I was one of the guardians of the waning forest. It's somewhere only our king can enter. Rumor has it that buried inside it are his parents, who also form the origins of us giants. The Giant King's court is formed of many parts, and the waning forest is one of them. Buried in there is the most ancient ancestor of the giants. Klein listened attentively, only wishing to ask more. To him, this was more valuable than the fourth epoch's history. This was because the city of Silver's hope likely laid in the Giant King's court. However, before he opened his mouth, Edwina spoke before him. Grozel, what did the book look like when you received it? Grozel raised his hand to rub his cheeks. It had nothing, like an empty book waiting to be written. I even thought that Grozel might be a completely fictional character in the book. Klein deliberated for a few seconds and didn't directly ask about the details of the Giant King's court. He turned to say to Mobit Zoroast, do you know of Blasphemer Amon? Blasphemer refers to the entire family of Amon. They are the archenemies of us Zoroasts. It's said that they have a very powerful and terrifying ancestor that even Ouroboros and Medici viewed with great importance. They even feel fear towards him, but no one knows of his actual name, Mobit introduced in detail. Ouroboros, Medici. Yes, back then the true creator and Rose Redemption supported the Solomon Empire. Klein's heart stirred as he immediately asked, then, have you heard of the name Sasra? Mobit was taken aback as he slowly shook his head. Never. Dark Angel Sasra's name and title vanished after the cataclysm. It was buried. Klein confirmed a fact through this. At that moment, Snowman, who was facing the stone wall, said with a deep voice, Sasra is the Dark Angel, the leader of the kings of angels, the one closest to the Lord. I was waiting for your answer. Klein cast his gaze on the ascetic and asked in a deep voice, apart from him, Ouroboros, Medici, and Amon, what other kings of angels are there? You don't have to say out all their names. Klein was afraid that it would result in unnecessary reactions, just like the Repenter in Afternoon Town. Edwina, Anderson, and Danitz were at a loss from the very beginning. This was because the contents of the conversation between Gehrman Sparrow and the few ancient figures were things that they had never heard of. They found it unbelievable that this crazy adventurer knew so many secrets. After a few seconds of silence, Snowman said, there's also the angel of imagination, Adam. Just as he said the name, the entire cave shook. The familiar and crazy tyrannical aura rapidly descended. King of the North Ulyssen had arrived. Chapter 699, Boss Fight Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios Lone Soldier, Frunzier Edward, who was on guard by the cave's entrance, saw a massive figure descend from the sky just as he moved. It landed on a huge boulder covered in thick layers of ice. The wings, which were covered in a membrane of skin, weren't retracted as they continued spreading outward, nearly blocking out all the surrounding light. The illusory armored scales that resembled frozen ice and the violent eerie blue dragon eyes were immediately reflected in Frunzier's eyes. He instinctively sensed danger as he raised his iron-black sword and leaped to the side, rolling far away from where he was standing. Almost at the same moment, King of the North Ulyssen opened its mouth, silently spewing out a distorted icy blue flame towards the cave. It froze everything in its wake. Moments later, the icy blue flames produced a tidal wave formed from illusory light as they surged into the dark cave, sealing everything it passed in ice. The words, "Angel of Imagination, Adam," were still flashing across Klein's mind as he couldn't help but recall Emperor Rosel's description of the Twilight Hermit Order. Their mission was to revive the original creator, and they had a high sequence beyonder of the spectator pathway among their ranks, or even the uniqueness. The means in which they summoned the members was through a true dream that connected the eastern and western ends of the continent. Furthermore, it had the characteristic of being detected upon being mentioned. But even so, he still instinctively reacted in response to the impending danger. He lunged sideways, dodging towards the uneven parts of the cave, attempting to use the rocks ahead to block the attack. However, the surging icy blue light was like a tidal wave that drowned every corner of the cave. It sealed everything, leaving no safe zones inside the cave. Seeing his surroundings turn into an icy cage, a gigantic, grayish-blue figure appeared before Klein's eyes. Grosel had stepped forward without a sound. He genuflected with his left knee, leaning his back forward as he stabbed the broadsword in front of him. Light that resembled the dawn of light bloomed as illusory walls formed to the left and right of Grosel, protecting everyone behind them. An icy blue, tidal wave surged over, splitting at the erect broadsword before colliding with the light of dawn on both sides. Everything in the mountain cave turned dark for Klein and company before a small source of light was restored. They could still see that the bonfire had been extinguished. It was especially dark with the dim rays of light outside attempting to tear through the layers of ice. At that moment, every inch of space in front of Grosel was frozen. The giant seemed to become a bug stuck in amber. Right on the heels of that, the sword which was embedded in the ground emitted a luster resembling the light of dawn. They mixed together, enveloping Grosel before turning into a hurricane of light that swept outwards. Silently, the layer of ice had a huge hole burned through it as it extended all the way to the cave's mouth. Grosel's grayish-blue figure had vanished from where he was. Elvish songster Ciadas, who hadn't had time to tie her head, held her bow and arrows. Embraced by the swirling gales around her, she charged out the cave without any delay. Dressed in an asymmetrical black coat, the Solomon Empire Viscount Mobit Zoroast mumbled, "Don't be in a rush," or "It's finally here," as he ran, following closely behind Ciadas. The ascetic, Snowman, stood up as well. He tapped his chest 4 times as though he was forming the shape of a cross. "May the Lord bless me." Amidst his hoarse and dry voice, he stepped onto the biting cold ice with his bare feet and ran out of the cave. Klein didn't hesitate either. He didn't draw his revolver, and he kept his hands empty. Together with Anderson, who was clenching Death Bracadon tightly, they ran into the hole in the ice. Dressed in a shirt with complicated patterns, Edwina Edwards looked at Danitz, who was trembling due to the aura of the high-level entity. She said with a gentle, but emotionless tone, "Stay here." Having said that, the look in her blue eyes deepened. Gales howled around her, pushing her out of the cave. "Stay here." Danitz was stunned. He subconsciously surveyed his surroundings and saw the walls covered in frost and a completely extinguished bonfire. The cave was silent with him being the only one left. Danitz's trembling body slowly came to a stop as he turned agape. However, he didn't say a word as he saw his captain's figure disappear from the cave's entrance. Outside the cave, Frunzier Edward, who had just rolled to avoid the first series of attacks, saw Ulyssin spread its wings as it was about to leap into the sky, closing the distance between it and his party. He ensured his safety as he steadied his figure and pushed his left palm out diagonally. Immediately following that, he declared a statement in ancient Hermes, "Flying is prohibited here." Suddenly, the frost dragon's wings that blotted out the sky seemed to be weighed down by invisible objects weighing 100 times its body weight. It began flapping them with great difficulty. The King of the North immediately let out a furious roar as the loud sonic boom drilled into Frunzier's ears, making his stagger. With a whoosh, the pair of wings finally managed to flap, stirring up the snow and frost around it into the air. Although it was difficult on Ulyssen's part, it eventually managed to fly. At that moment, disciplinary paladin Frunzier's expression turned solemn. He said a sentence constructed in ancient Hermes once again, violators will be punished. Just as he said that, his figure leaped up at a speed which was faster than Ulyssen, as though he had been augmented by some unknown power. Ding! Frunzier extended his body in midair as he brandished the iron-black sword in hand, striking down at the King of the North's neck with his posture speaking great certainty of a hit. A clear crack appeared on the crystalline armor plates as it spread slightly, however, this failed to make Ulyssen bleed. The frost dragon didn't even feel the pain as its eerie blue eyes locked onto Frunzier, its expression cruel and tyrannical. It then lifted up its front claws while Frunzier remained in midair without any means of dodging. At that critical moment, a hurricane blew over, pushing the black-armored disciplinary paladin away, causing Ulyssen's strike to swipe at air. Its strike caused an explosive boom despite the miss. Elvish songster Ciadas didn't hesitate to take action once she rushed out the cave, saving Frunzier immediately. Immediately following that, her hair flared up in violation of the laws of nature. They were distinct with swirling lightning bolts. She aimed her arrow at the large but slow, flying target in the sky, King of the North, before firmly pulling back the arrow. The sky turned dark, as though dark clouds had gathered as lightning bounced through them. Unable to fly smoothly due to the disciplinary paladin's influence, Ulyssen suddenly pulled back its wings, swooping down at Ciadas like a high-speed train. At that moment, a grayish-blue figure that left one feeling safe had appeared in front of the King of the North's trajectory. Grosel genuflected once again, plunging the broadsword, which was unusable by human hands, in front of himself. Dawn-like light surfaced, forming an invisible, impenetrable wall. Boom! The collision between the frost dragon and Grosel was like a terrifying explosion. It shattered the layers of ice around them, pushing them outwards. Grosel failed to keep his footing firm as he flew out like a ball, tumbling past Ciadas before slamming loudly into the mountain wall. A huge amount of snow and ice stalactites crashed from above, nearly causing an avalanche. As for Ulyssen, it wasn't sent retreating. It remained standing in its original spot. Having had its swooping attack interrupted, its hind legs were in the ground as its body leaned forward. It shook its neck before aiming its open mouth at Ciadas. The Solomon Empire's noble, Mobed Zoroast, had long arrived beside Ciadas. Upon seeing this, he hurriedly extended his right hand and rapidly turned his wrist. Ulyssen forgot what it was doing despite having its mouth completely open. It stood there in a daze without continuing its attack. Suddenly, Mobit turned his head and spit to the side. Pooey! The spit was ordinary without any special traits to it. Seizing this opportunity, Snowman, the ascetic who came out, raised his arms as though he was embracing God's grace. Then, he said to the elvish songster in ancient Hermes, God says it's effective. With a sizzling sound, the flashes of lightning surrounding Ciadas brightened greatly as they surged out, entangling with the arrow. She released her grip as an arrow shot out. Boom! Dark clouds gathered in the air as a thick bolt of lightning smote down, augmenting that arrow. The arrow turned completely silver, as though it was shot from the god of lightning. It struck Ulyssen's forehead at a completely unavoidable speed. Layers of ice disappeared as the illusory armor plating cracked. The arrow stabbed into the King of the North's head, making it let out a deafening cry. Light blue blood gushed out and quickly froze as the frost dragon's ugly face shook violently as silver bolts zapped at it. At that moment, Klein and Anderson came out of the cave. Disciplinary paladin Frunzier had tumbled onto the ground before standing up again. Grosel extended his palms from the snow pile, rubbing his head. He didn't appear seriously injured. With so many teammates, I don't have to be the main assault force. I can attempt to control Ulyssen's spirit-body threads. From my observations, it doesn't seem to have the defensive abilities of a demigod. Of course, it's much stronger than a Sequence 5. A 5-meter radius is a little dangerous. Klein looked at the frost dragon as he quickly had an idea. Chapter 700, Excellent Teamwork Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios King of the North. Ulysses' tragic cries rapidly turned into a roar. Following that, a snowstorm engulfed the area outside the cave, reducing the visibility to less than 5 meters. Howling gales swept up dense goose feathers as they covered every inch of space. Meanwhile, an icy blue halo rapidly extended outwards, clinging close to the ground. It left frozen ice everywhere in its wake as it passed. Klein, who had his vision and hearing affected by the blizzard, instantly had the corresponding scene surface in his mind. He hurriedly bent his knees and kicked his heels, jumping high up, allowing the icy blue halo to sweep underneath him. As for Mobit Zoroast, who wasn't adept at combat, he was already too close to the icy blue halo when he noticed it. He didn't have the time to jump up. At that moment, he was hoisted up by his shoulders as the bottom of his feet had a tempestuous hurricane lift him up into the air. With this combination, he instantly flew up into the sky, avoiding the outcome of being frozen. Mobit turned his head and, without surprise, saw the deadpan Ciadas. This elvish songster could only muster up strong winds to glide forward due to the law forbidding flight. Anderson, Edwina, Snowman, and Frunzier reacted accordingly, jumping in time and dodging the attack without succumbing to it. Only Grozel, who had just pulled out his broadsword from the snow, was hit in the legs by the icy blue halo, as he couldn't dodge in time. Layers of ice instantly surged upwards as Grozel stood on the spot like a frozen corpse. Whoosh! The exaggerated blizzard obscured all the Beyonders' vision, making them lose their vision of the frost dragon. All they could do was passively defend against any attacks. At that moment, Snowman, who hadn't dropped to the ground, spread out his arms once again and said solemnly in ancient Hermes, "God says it's ineffective." The violent blizzard suddenly calmed down significantly. Be it the tempestuous hurricanes or the dense snowflakes, they were weakened or had been cut in half. Ciadas vaguely made out a gigantic face with an ugly lizard-like face. The broken arrow was still embedded in its forehead. Ulysses had taken the opportunity to close the distance between them. Ciadas didn't panic. The strong wind suddenly changed directions, sending Mobit and her floating backward. Meanwhile, her chilled, pale lips opened as she sang in ancient and abstruse Elvish, "The rocks are destined to be shattered by the waves, the trees are destined to be struck down by the winds, the mountains are destined to crumble by the lightning." As every word in Elvish was rich and filled with meaning, the constructed sentences were extremely succinct. Therefore, the lyrics didn't waste too much of Ciadas's time. Furthermore, from the moment the first word was spoken and from the beginning of the beautiful and forceful rhythm, the winds in the blizzard began to experience changes. The howling sounds of wind turned chaotic as it spread out in every direction. Ulysses' massive figure once again appeared before Klein and company's eyes. When Ciadas sang the third phrase, disciplinary paladin Frunzier had already pushed out his right palm and profoundly said in ancient Hermes, "Imprison." Instantly, the frost dragon which was about to rush Ciadas and Mobit had frozen on the spot. Surrounding it were layers of transparent walls. And as Frunzier said that softly, Edwina, who had just found her footing, made her light blue eyes turn black. Inside them flowed a sticky liquid that seemed to be the manifestation of all the evil in the depths of one's heart. She gently clenched her right palm as Ulysses stood up with a roar, instantly ripping apart the effects of imprison. The frost dragon's eerie blue eyes were filled with blankness and pain. It seemed to be still immersed in the emotions of sudden madness and ruthlessness. Even though this was a state it was always in, to have it fully triggered was uncomfortable. Without a doubt, it was a dragon who found it difficult to control its emotions. Seizing the opportunity of Ulysses' brief pause, Anderson Hood condensed a burning white spear in his hand. Then, he bent his back and threw it out. Without waiting for the outcome, flames appeared under the strongest hunter's feet, turning the ice into liquid. So. The spear accurately struck the frost dragon's half-open mouth, quickly melting the thick armor plates of ice, with the excess force penetrating the upper part of its forehead. Ulysses let out another tragic cry as its hind legs stomped backward, sending its body lunging forward. It stayed close to the ground as it rushed towards Anderson with a terrifying speed. The only thing in its eyes was this worm that had dealt significant amounts of damage to it. Schwing! The snow split apart as a deep and wide chasm opened up in the ground. It emanated all the way to where Anderson was as it continued extending. Bang! With its terrifying inertia, the frost dragon slammed into a boulder covered in thick ice, shattering its outer shell and cracking its interior. If Anderson had collided with it, the strongest hunter was bound to turn into meat paste. Even being brushed was likely to lead to his death. However, in a particular spot in the chasm where Anderson was originally standing, there was a dark hole that led straight down. It was just enough for a person to burrow in. Pa! A hand held onto the hole's entrance. Through the exertion of force, the strongest hunter with disheveled hair jumped out. After he threw the burning spear, he didn't dodge in panic. Instead, he directly used his Beyonder powers to melt the snow beneath his feet, and he burned the underlying soil. Silently, he created a hole that wasn't too deep. Following that, he sank himself into it by crouching, perfectly dodging the King of the North's charge. At that moment, a pure beam of light descended and struck Grosel, quickly melting the ice encasing him. Snowman had used an offensive blow to remove the restrictions placed on the giant guardian. With the explosive light of dawn, Grosel raised his broadsword and charged to the frost dragon with wide strides before cleaving down wildly. Bang! 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 Grosel was only a meter shorter than Ulysses' non-humanoid form. His strength was equally ridiculous. As he clashed repeatedly with Ulysses' front claws, occasionally wavering and retreating at times, he quickly recovered by taking a step forward and engaged his opponent. With the giant guardian occupying the frost dragon's attention, the others reacted accordingly with relative composure. Snowman maintained his spread arms as a sun-like halo appeared around him. It quickly spread outwards, warming up all his companions and giving them immense courage. Furthermore, he carefully ensured that it avoided the King of the North. Not far from him, Ciata's hair flared up as she drew her bowstring. She shot out arrows that appeared to be formed by wind blades or lightning. Due to the massive target, every single one of her arrows had hit her target. Furthermore, all of the arrows struck the same spot, the frost dragon's shoulder. Mobit Zoroast worked with Grosel, occasionally stealing the thoughts the King of the North had and was about to execute, making it pause briefly. At other times, he would attempt to steal its powers, but in the few times he didn't have any success. With the pitch-black sword, Anderson carefully circled to the frost dragon's flank and attempted to strike a particular spot. Disciplinary Paladin Frunzier brandished his iron-black sword, using prohibition and imprison to aid Grosel's brawl with the frost dragon. Without his restraints, even if the giant was a guardian, he would have long been sent flying, suffering from a fatal stomp or the spewing of breath. Klein looked at Edwina and raised his hand to point at himself. Invisibility. He didn't know if she had the ability to mimic this power. If it wasn't possible, he needed to consider using other methods. Edwina didn't ask why, as her light blue and limpid eyes immediately reflected Gehrman Sparrow's body, which lost its color and turned transparent. Following that, Klein's figure became faint and vanished. After confirming his condition, Klein quickly ran towards the intense clash between the giant and the dragon. With a roll, he arrived by the King of the North's left foot. Then, as he focused on dodging Ulysses' feet while it did battle, he emanated his spirituality to control the illusory black threads with the spirit body threads vision he had long activated. Right on the heels of that, he would roll or leap around, in search of space beneath or around the frost dragon. So. Silver lightning arrows and pure azure wind blades landed in a small region, shattering the armor plates of ice, tearing apart the resilient skin. Soon, the frost dragon's right shoulder was a swath of light blue. The corresponding claw's motions also appeared to slow down indiscernibly. Disciplinary Paladin Frunzier acutely noticed this point. As he dodged the icy blue breath, he pointed in that direction and declared in ancient Hermes, "Death." With a bursting sound, the blue blood flowing from Ulyssen's right shoulder instantly dried up, and the tear allowed its translucent bones to be seen. At that moment, Edwina used a palm-sized brass mirror and reflected parts of Ulyssen's body in it. She reached out her right hand and grabbed at the mirror's surface, pinching the reflection within. Then, she forcefully pulled outwards. Ulyssen's wound instantly worsened. It kept spreading as though it was about to lose one of its front claws. It let out a tragic cry as it suddenly raised its body, standing on its hind legs. Light blue light that was almost white surged out of the dragon. In 100-meter range, the temperature plummeted, followed by a fearsome force. Suddenly, all the Beyonders were sealed in ice. Their bodies became extremely cold as they turned very stiff. They couldn't help but tremble. Ciadas, Mobit, Edwina, Klein, Grosel, Anderson, and Frunzier all shared similar symptoms. The only one who barely maintained his mobility was the ascetic, Snowman, thanks to withstanding the training of being frozen countless times. He maintained his spread arms, half-closed his eyes, and solemnly said, "God loves everyone." Sunlight tore through the wind and snow as the warmth began to melt the feeling of being frozen. Bang! Ulyssen sent Grosel flying with a claw, severely injuring the giant guardian by leaving a depression in his chest. It temporarily ignored the rest as it targeted Snowman, Blitz rushing him. Snowman has no one protecting him. It's about to move beyond a 5-meter radius. Klein watched this scene, feeling somewhat numb. He had the urge of running into the cave to pray to himself before using the sea god scepter above the grey fog to respond. At that moment, a scarlet fireball appeared beside the ascetic before the frost dragon arrived. Then, it exploded without any reservations, sending him flying. It was from the strongest hunter, Anderson. At that moment, Edwina had produced a fireball in her hand and threw it at Ulyssen's back, but she failed to hit it. She was creating a passageway for Klein to phase over with the fire. She had learned from Danitz of this ability Gehrman Sparrow had.